November 6, 1860, in the quiet tobacco hills of central Virginia, a plantation owner lit a cigar to celebrate Abraham Lincoln's election rolled by the one man he trusted above all others. By dawn, his lips were dark, his throat swollen shut, and his heart no longer beating. They called it apoplexy, but what the doctor's private journal revealed 70 years later would expose something far more deliberate and far more terrifying. Buckingham County, Virginia. In the final weeks of 1860, the land rolled like a green and gold sea, each hill crest crowned with barns thick with the scent of curing tobacco. Smoke hung in the air, sweet, sharp, and earthy, clinging to the skin and clothes of everyone who worked it. This was the Hafford Plantation, 12,000 acres of prime soil stretching from the banks of the Willis River to the oak-shadowed forest beyond. And ruling it all was Colonel Marcus Hafford, a man who believed his fortune, his title, and even his breath were ordained by God himself. The colonel stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with gray threading through his dark hair and blue eyes that saw everything except his own decay. He had the manners of a gentleman and the temper of a soldier. His words carried weight in Buckingham County, weight born of land, labor, and fear. People said he was fair, kinder than most. He never beat a man himself. That was the overseer's job. Silas Portwood, rail-thin and stone-faced, carried out punishment with precision. He did not smile when he lifted the whip. He did not scowl either. He simply obeyed. The colonel valued obedience above all else. From his wife, from his slaves, from his crops, from the very soil. Everything on his land bent to his will. Everything except time and one man who had learned to hide his thoughts behind silence. His name was Benjamin. They called him Benj. He had been born on the Hafford Plantation 34 years earlier, son of a housemaid named Celia who died of fever when he was 12. The colonel had noticed the boy's steady hands, his sharp eyes, and his quiet way of doing things. He trained him in the delicate art of tobacco preparation, drying, curing, aging, blending, rolling, an art that could turn leaves into luxury. Over years, Benj became the master of flavor. The colonel's cigars, known across the county, were Benj's creation. Benj lived in 2 worlds, one of silence, one of observation. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He moved through the house like a shadow, trusted, unseen, indispensable. He knew the colonel's habits, his moods, his brandy, his tobacco, the exact way he liked his cigars rolled, thick, rich, laced with a hint of rum. He also knew things the colonel did not know, things no slave was meant to know. Benj could read. Celia had taught him with scraps of newspaper and a tattered Bible sheet hidden beneath her mattress. Every night, after the quarters went still, she whispered letters, words, and meanings by candlelight until he could read a sentence on his own. When she died, he continued in secret, reading every page that passed through the household invoices, newspapers, discarded pamphlets. Later, he began reading from the colonel's own library, agricultural journals, political tracts, and one medical text that fascinated him more than any other. Practical treatise on poisons and their antidotes. He read about arsenic and belladonna, about foxglove and hemlock, about the delicate boundary between remedy and death. He learned that tobacco itself contained a poison called nicotine, a stimulant in small amounts, a killer in large ones. He memorized symptoms, racing pulse, convulsions, paralysis of the lungs. He studied how it entered the body through the skin, through the mouth, through smoke. He read until he could recite every page from memory. To the colonel, Benj was loyal. To himself, he was patient. Patience was the only weapon a slave could wield. That autumn, the world beyond Buckingham was trembling. The election approached. Lincoln's name was on every tongue, spoken with venom in every Virginia parlor. At Hafford, men gathered by candlelight to discuss what they called the coming storm. They drank whiskey and shouted about Northern aggression, about the future of their way of life. Benj served them all, refilling glasses, clearing plates, catching fragments of their conversations like ash drifting from a fire. When one guest declared that Lincoln's election would be the spark that burned the South clean, the colonel had laughed, his cigar glowing between his fingers. Lincoln's a lawyer, not a soldier, he said. He'll bluster, but he won't act. And even if he does, men like me will never bow to him. Our way of life is ordained. Benj had stood at his elbow, silent, steady, eyes lowered. The colonel never noticed that those same eyes flicked once toward the cigar, then to the decanter of rum beside it. He never noticed the calculation behind that stillness when the guests were gone. The colonel returned to his study, lit another cigar, and praised Benj's skill. "You've outdone yourself," he said. "Best tobacco I've ever tasted. What did you change?" "Just a touch more aging, sir," Benj replied softly. "And the finest leaves from the north barn." The colonel chuckled. "Keep it up. You may be worth more than I paid for you yet." Benj bowed his head and left. He didn't show a flicker of emotion, but that night, in the narrow bed of his quarters, he stared at the ceiling until dawn and thought about what the book had said about the fine line between stimulation and death, about dosage, about time, about how the thing that made the colonel's life so pleasurable could also end it. In the weeks that followed, he began experimenting. A few drops of concentrated extract on discarded cigar wrappers, tested on small animals near the river. He measured the effects, watched, learned. He adjusted. He documented in his mind every result, every reaction. And he understood death could be built slowly, like a harvest. You planted it, you nurtured it, and you waited. By the time November came and the nation chose its new president, Benj's plan was already in motion. The cigars were ready. The poison was perfect. And all that remained was for the master to celebrate. The sky over Buckingham County was the color of iron that night, low and heavy, pressing down on the rolling tobacco fields like the weight of something inevitable. A wind moved through the magnolias, dry and restless, carrying the distant sound of hounds from another plantation. By midnight, the lamps in the main house of Hafford burned like small suns in the darkness, their glow spilling through the tall windows of the study. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and rage. Colonel Marcus Hafford had returned from town an hour earlier, his boots still spattered with mud from the courthouse square, where angry men had shouted themselves hoarse as news traveled down the telegraph lines. Lincoln had won, a Northerner, an abolitionist, a man who, in the colonel's words, had no business telling Virginians how to live or whom to own. Now, the colonel moved from room to room like a storm given human shape, demanding brandy, shouting for his wife, cursing the country, the government, and the Almighty himself. Catherine Hafford, pale and trembling, had retreated upstairs. The servants had vanished into the shadows. Only Benj remained, silent in the hall, waiting for the inevitable summons. He had known this night was coming. He had been waiting for it, preparing for it, building toward it the way a craftsman builds toward perfection. 3 months of patient work, 3 months of careful measurement, 3 months of watching and waiting. Now the hour had come. The study door swung open so violently that the latch struck the wall. The colonel filled the doorway, his cravat loosened, his face red and glistening with drink. "Benj, where the hell are you?" His voice was raw, ragged. "Bring me my cigars, the whole damn box, and the French brandy. None of that cheap Virginia stuff. Do you hear me?" "Yes, sir," Benj said, his tone as steady as a metronome. He walked to the cabinet in the corner of the hallway, the one only he had the key for, and opened the humidor. Two identical boxes waited inside, polished cedar gleaming in the lamplight. One was harmless. The other, prepared over weeks with patient calculation, was not. Benj lifted the poisoned box carefully, his fingers steady, his heart a slow drumbeat beneath his ribs. The cigars inside smelled of luxury, a blend of Havana and Virginia leaf, dark, rich, perfectly aged. They were beautiful, flawless, deadly. He carried the box to the study along with the decanter of brandy in a single crystal glass. When he entered, the colonel was pacing in front of the fireplace, his reflection flashing across the brass of his spurs. Papers littered the floor, torn maps, broken quills. The air smelled of anger and smoke. "The country's gone mad," the colonel said without looking up. "Lincoln, that backwoods lawyer. They'll destroy everything we built here. Everything. You understand, Benj? They mean to tear down the South itself." "Yes, sir," Benj said quietly, setting the box on the desk. The colonel turned, eyes bloodshot, unfocused. "You don't understand. You people never do. You need men like me to keep order, to keep things running. Without us, there's chaos, anarchy." He seized the decanter and poured a glass so full it spilled over his fingers. "But not tonight. Tonight, I'll drink to the Union's funeral." He drained half the glass, slammed it down, and opened the humidor. The sweet, earthy perfume of tobacco filled the room. He smiled, a little crookedly. "At least I've still got these." He chose one, rolled it between his fingers, and struck a match. The flame flickered against his face as he lit the cigar, drawing the first plume of smoke into his lungs. His eyes closed in momentary pleasure. Damn fine, he murmured. Best you've ever made, Benj. The taste remarkable. What did you say you did differently? Just a longer cure, sir, Benj said, standing by the door. 6 months in the north barn. Well, the colonel said, exhaling a slow, luxurious cloud. Whatever you did, keep doing it. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. These cigars are worth more than you are. Benj said nothing. His face was unreadable. But inside, something tightened and then loosened, like a knot finally untying itself. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 1 in the morning. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the shutters. The colonel smoked steadily, brandy glass refilling, ashtray filling with the curled remains of one cigar after another. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of his thoughts, ranting about secession, about honor, about northern bankers and God's will. Ben stood still, invisible, his hands clasped behind his back. The room smelled of smoke and sweat and oak-polished dot by the time the colonel lit his third cigar. His speech had grown slurred. "You're a good Negro, Benj," he said, squinting through the haze. "I've treated you well, haven't I? Given you work that matters. Trusted you. You should be grateful." "Yes, sir," Benj replied softly. "Very grateful." The colonel nodded as though reassured, then took another deep pull on the cigar. His hand trembled slightly. He frowned and rubbed his temple. "Too much brandy," he muttered. "Too damn hot in here." He stood, swayed, and sat back down heavily. "Maybe one more." He lit the fourth cigar with unsteady fingers. The smoke came thick this time, curling upward in heavy, twisting ribbons. Benj watched as the colonel's color began to drain from his face. His lips darkened. A sheen of sweat broke across his brow. His breathing quickened. Don't feel right," the colonel said, touching his throat. "Benj, fetch the doctor." "Yes, sir," Benj said. But he didn't move. The colonel's eyes met his across the room. For the first time in their long, unequal history, the colonel saw something he'd never seen before. The stillness of a man who was not afraid. His pupils widened. Understanding flickered, then settled. "You," he whispered. "You did this." Benj said nothing. The silence between them was heavy as lead. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the faint crackle of the fire. The colonel tried to stand again, but collapsed back into the chair, clutching at his chest. His breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, each one smaller than the last. He was fully conscious, fully aware, his body rebelling against him inch by inch. Benj knew the symptoms: rapid pulse, paralysis of the diaphragm, the slow drowning from within. He had memorized every detail, and now he watched them unfold exactly as he'd expected. The colonel's hand reached out, shaking, toward him. Whether for help or accusation, Benj didn't care. He didn't move. He simply stood, his face calm, his eyes dark and steady. The cigar slipped from the colonel's fingers and fell to the rug, scattering ash. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His heart stuttered once, twice, then stopped. The study fell silent. Outside, the wind sighed through the magnolias. The fire crackled softly in the grate. The clock chimed for times. Benj exhaled, slow and controlled, then stepped forward. He touched the colonel's wrist. No pulse. He waited another minute to be sure. Then he collected the cigar box, replacing it with the identical one from the hall. He arranged the decanter and the glass, adjusted the fallen cigar, made the scene look careless, natural, a man who had smoked and drunk himself into the grave. When he was done, he stepped back and studied his work. The colonel sat slumped in the chair, mouth slightly open, eyes glassy. The faint scent of burnt tobacco hung in the air. It looked perfect. It looked inevitable. Benj closed the door quietly behind him. He walked through the silent halls of the mansion, the wooden floor creaking under his bare feet. The other servants slept behind their thin walls, dreaming uneasy dreams. Outside, the barns loomed against the fading night, their chimneys breathing slow ribbons of smoke. He crossed the yard to his small room, removed his shirt, and lay down on the narrow bed. His hands were steady. His mind was empty. The deed was done. He did not sleep. He watched the thin line of dawn grow along the horizon, pale and cold. Birds began to call. Somewhere, a door slammed. A dog barked. He felt nothing, not triumph, not guilt, not relief, only the vast stillness of something finished. At 7, the scream came. He heard it from the main house, a woman's cry that cut through the morning air. Then shouting, running feet, the dull panic of servants colliding in hallways. He rose, washed his face in the basin, and walked back across the yard. When he entered the foyer, the house was chaos. The mistress lay fainting on the stairs. The overseer was shouting orders. The doctor's name was being called again and again. Benj blended into the motion of it all, silent, invisible, dutiful. He helped carry water. He fetched linens. He stood with the others when the doctor arrived and pronounced what everyone already believed. Apoplexy, he said gravely, brought on by agitation, by drink, by overexcitement. I've seen it before. The colonel's wife wept softly, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Porwood muttered about bad luck. The doctor made his notes. Everything proceeded according to the script of tragedy the South understood. Great men sometimes died of strong emotions. There was nothing more to it. No one questioned the servant standing quietly near the door, his face composed, his eyes lowered. The funeral came 3 days later, under a sky the color of pewter, the churchyard filled with carriages and umbrellas. The minister spoke of virtue and faith, of the colonel's generosity and leadership. The congregation murmured its approval. The coffin descended into the earth. Rain began to fall, soft and cold, turning the red clay to mud. Ben stood at the back with the other house servants, hat in hand. Head bowed dot when the final hymn ended and the mourners drifted away. He looked once at the fresh mound of earth. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wet tobacco leaves from the curing barns beyond the hill. He turned and walked back toward the plantation, toward the quarters, toward the life that would continue as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. Everything had died. The overseer took control. The mistress retreated into mourning. The fields went quiet for days, the air heavy with rumor and unease. At night, Ben sat outside his cabin and watched the lights in the big house flicker one by one. Sometimes he thought he heard the faint echo of coughing from the study, or the creak of the leather chair shifting under a weight that wasn't there. Maybe imagination, maybe memory, maybe something else. He knew he couldn't stay forever. The plantation was no longer safe. He'd done what he came to do, but he wasn't finished. He had plans now, built on the same patience that had carried him this far. Plans that reached beyond these fields, beyond Virginia, beyond slavery itself. In the colonel's study were ledgers and letters, documents that spoke of Confederate sympathies, of Northern contacts, of hidden stores of gold and weapons. Benj had read them all over the years. He remembered every word. Knowledge was currency, and he intended to use it. For now, he waited. He worked. He rolled cigars. He listened. The world outside Buckingham County was changing. Lincoln would take office. War would come. Freedom, perhaps, would come with it. But if it didn't, Benj would find his own when he closed his eyes at night. He saw the colonel's face as it had been in the last instant, the flicker of understanding, the collapse of certainty, the look of a man realizing too late that he was not immortal. That memory stayed with Benj like the aftertaste of smoke, bitter and satisfying. In the morning, he rose with the others, went to the barns, and began sorting leaves for the next batch of cigars. The air was rich with the scent of tobacco, the same scent that had carried death into the colonel's lungs. As the sun rose over the fields, its light catching the golden edges of the leaves, Ben smiled once, faintly, and no one saw. The plantation carried on. The smoke still rose from the barns. The hands still worked the soil. Life went on exactly as before, except that the master was gone, and the quiet man who rolled his cigars had proven that even in bondage, intelligence could be sharper than the whip, and somewhere in the cooling ashes of that study, the cigars that killed a master still waited in their box, perfectly rolled, perfectly preserved, perfectly deadly. The rain came hard the morning after the funeral, sweeping across the tobacco fields in silver sheets that blurred the world into gray. The earth drank greedily, as if it had been waiting for this cleansing. But the water couldn't wash away the rot that had taken root in the Hafford plantation. It was quiet now to quiet. The house no longer echoed with the colonel's booming voice, no longer carried the bark of orders, no longer smelled of brandy and cigars. What remained was a strained hollowness, a pause between breaths. Catherine Hafford spent her days locked in her room, her morning clothes heavy and black, her face pale as wax. Sometimes Benj could hear her crying through the walls, the sound thin and lost, like wind through dry leaves. Silas Portwood ran the fields now, snapping orders with brittle authority, trying to fill the vacuum the colonel had left behind. But even he seemed diminished, as though the plantation itself no longer respected him. The men worked slower. The women whispered more. The rhythm of the place, its cruel, steady heartbeat had faltered. Benj noticed everything. He noticed how the horses startled at shadows, how the dogs barked at nothing, how the white folks began avoiding the study after dusk. They said the room smelled strange, but no matter how many windows they opened, the air felt thick, clinging, heavy with the ghost of smoke. The doctor had said apoplexy, the minister had said God's will, but the servants said something else in voices low and careful. The colonel don't rest easy. Benj said nothing. He just worked. He spent his days rolling cigars in the workshop behind the main house. The steady rasp of tobacco leaves the kind of music that kept his thoughts in order. The colonel had died with 4 of his cigars burned to ash. Another box sat unopened in the humidor, indistinguishable from the rest. Each one a perfect replica, each one capable of doing exactly what it was designed to do, slowly, silently, beautifully. Death wrapped in silk leaf, the colonel had believed himself irreplaceable. But the world had already begun moving on without him. Merchants came from Richmond to settle debts. Papers were signed. Carts rolled in and out of the yard carrying furniture, barrels, crates. Catherine didn't oversee any of it. She was fading, her body shrinking beneath her widow's weeds. Portwood handled the details, his thin hands always restless, always twitching toward the whip at his side. He didn't understand what was happening to him. The authority he'd once borrowed from the colonel had evaporated. The people he ordered around obeyed more slowly now. They looked him in the eye when they shouldn't have. Something in the air had shifted, something too subtle for him to name, but heavy enough to feel. At night, Ben sat on the stoop of his small room and watched the house lights flicker against the wet darkness. The smell of wet tobacco drifted from the barns, sweet and bitter at once. He thought of his mother and the lesson she'd whispered in the dark. Keep quiet. Keep watching. Learn everything they think you can. He had learned, and now he waited. Winter crept in early that year. Frost rimed the magnolia leaves, and the mornings came wrapped in mist that rolled off the river. The enslaved workers huddled by the fires in the quarters, talking in murmurs about war. Word had come from Richmond, South Carolina had seceded. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia were following fast. The air was thick with talk of independence, of pride, of blood. Portwood rode into town every few days and came back meaner each time, his temper raw, his eyes sunken. He took it out on everyone. His whip cracked more often. He shouted until his throat was hoarse. The men worked with heads bowed and eyes cold. The women watched him with quiet hatred. Only Ben seemed untouched, calm as a still pond while everyone else boiled. One night in January, Portwood came back from town drunk and furious, muttering about abolitionists, about Northern spies, about rumors that slaves were planning uprisings. He stormed through the quarters, shouting for obedience, threatening punishment for disobedience that no one had committed. Ben stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching. Portwood stopped when he saw him. "You," he snarled. "You think you're special, don't you? You think the old man's dead. You can do as you please. But I know better. You're just another dark-skinned liar waiting to steal what isn't yours." Ben said nothing. Silence had always been his shield. Portwood stepped closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "I ought to take that clever mouth of yours and—" He stopped. His head swam suddenly, his eyes going glassy. He swayed, blinking. "Damn heat," he muttered, though the air was cold. He stumbled back, pressing a hand to his chest. Too much drink. Then, as if to prove he was fine, he pulled a cigar from his pocket and lit it. Ben recognized it instantly, one of the colonel's. Portwood had taken to helping himself to the old man's private stock since his death. Believing himself entitled now, he drew on the cigar deeply, exhaled, and gave Ben a crooked grin. "You look at me like that again, boy, and I'll—" His voice caught. He coughed once, twice, hard. The cigar trembled between his fingers. The grin faltered. "Damn smoke," he rasped, thumping his chest. "Bad batch." He fell forward, the cigar rolling into the mud, still burning faintly in the dark. His hands clawed at his throat. Ben didn't move. He stood there, watching the overseer struggle, watching the familiar signs unfold: sweat, pallor, spasms, the sound of air being stolen from a man's lungs. It was over in minutes. Portwood lay still, eyes open to the night, the cigar's ember dying beside him. Ben waited until the body cooled. Then he turned and walked back to his room. The next morning, when the plantation awoke, he was already in the fields, his face calm, his movements steady. The alarm came soon enough. Shouts, running feet, the sound of someone pounding on the mistress's door. Dr. Grimby came again, tired, puzzled. His spectacles fogged from the morning chill. He examined the corpse, listened to Catherine's trembling questions, and gave the same answer he'd given before. Apoplexy, he said. A sudden seizure, brought on by drink and exhaustion. No one argued. The plantation buried Silas Portwood behind the barn. The grave was shallow. The preacher didn't bother to come. That night, the quarters were silent. The people didn't celebrate, not openly. But a change had settled over them like a shared breath of relief. The overseer was gone. The colonel was gone. The mistress was planning to leave. The chain that had held them all together was rusting away. Catherine announced her intentions a week later. She would return to Richmond, to her father's house, where she'd be safe from whatever storm the country was brewing. The plantation, she said, would be sold. The nephew in Charleston would handle it. Until then, the property would remain under minimal supervision. She didn't look at the enslaved people as she spoke. She spoke as though addressing furniture. When she rode away that March morning, the wheels of her carriage throwing up dust, no one waved goodbye. Benj watched her go, his hands tucked behind his back, the wind stirring the edge of his coat. The sky was pale and clear, the color of bone. The plantation was his now not by law, but by truth. Every man who had claimed ownership of this land was either in the ground or soon would be. The house behind him stood silent, its white columns streaked with rain. Somewhere inside, in the lock study, the rest of the cigars waited. Sleeping like snakes in cedar boxes, he thought of them sometimes, those small, perfect instruments of balance. He had prepared enough to last years. He'd been methodical, hiding them in places no one would think to look, in drawers, in trunks, in the rafters of the smoking room, each box marked only in his memory, each one holding the same quiet promise. He didn't know who would light them next. He only knew that someone would. And when they did, justice would rise again in a cloud of smoke. The fields began to yellow as spring approached. Without leadership, without purpose, the plantation decayed. Workers did what they were told and no more. Tools went unrepaired. The barns filled with rot. Buyers came and went, each walking the property with skeptical eyes, each leaving unsettled. There was talk in town that the place was cursed, that the study where Dumaine had died was haunted, that the house itself exhaled poison. The doctor advised burning sulfur candles, but the smell never left. It clung to the wallpaper, the curtains, the wood thick and bitter, like something waiting. Benj moved quietly through it all, invisible as ever. He gathered what he needed, a few coins, a pair of boots, a small knife, a map torn from an old almanac. He'd been planning his flight for months, marking paths in his mind. He knew where the patrols rode, where the dogs were kept, where the rivers could be crossed. He'd spoken to no one, but he'd listened to whispers about safe houses in the mountains, about Quakers who helped fugitives, about something called the railroad that had no tracks and no trains, but still carried people north. He chose a night without moon. The sky was low and dark, the air sharp with the smell of rain. He left his room before midnight, carrying nothing but what he could fit into a small sack. He paused at the edge of the yard, looking back at the great house one last time. Its windows were black, its chimneys cold. He could almost see the colonel there, sitting in his chair, cigar in hand, frozen forever in that final moment. For the first time since that night, Benj allowed himself to whisper a single word, free. Then he turned and walked into the trees. He followed the river north, moving by instinct, avoiding roads, sleeping by day beneath the thickest cover he could find. The land was cold and damp, but the air tasted clean, announced at dawn. On the third day, he crossed into the foothills of the Blue Ridge. There, hidden cabins waited like silent sentinels. A blacksmith's wife gave him bread. A preacher gave him a coat. A white farmer's boy pointed him toward the next valley with nothing more than a nod. The network was real. The whispers had been true. He was not alone. Each mile took him farther from Buckingham County, farther from the fields that had claimed his childhood. But he never felt relief, only the same calm, measured focus that had carried him through everything else. Freedom, he realized, wasn't a single act. It was a practice, a discipline. It required patience, like curing tobacco. You prepared it. You waited, and one day it was ready. By the time he reached Pennsylvania, he had a new name, Benjamin Freeman. The irony pleased him. He found work in a tobacco warehouse, rolling leaves just as he always had. The difference was choice. He worked because he wanted to, not because someone owned his hands. Each cigar he made was clean, each one a small act of reclamation. But he knew what he had left behind. He knew that the plantation still breathed, that the house still stood, that the cigars still waited, and he knew, with the certainty of someone who has studied both patience and poison, that time would finish what he'd begun. 3 months later, a letter reached Pennsylvania. It came from Virginia, written by a merchant Benj had once seen at the plantation. The man was dead before the ink dried. Another victim of apoplexy, they said. The rumor spread that the Hafford property was cursed. Benj read about it in a discarded newspaper, sitting alone in the back of a Boston tavern. He smiled not widely, but deeply, from a place no one could see. He had lived as a shadow, as property, as silence itself. Now he lived as proof that silence could think, could plan, could strike. The world had called him less than human. He had answered in the language they understood best: profit, precision, patience, and death. That night, he rolled another cigar by lamplight, slow and perfect. When he finished, he set it beside the window and watched the smoke curl into the cold northern air. Somewhere far to the south, he imagined the same smoke rising over a crumbling mansion, carrying with it the last whispers of the old world. And for the first time, he smiled. By the summer of 1861, the Hafford plantation had become a wound in the landscape, open, festering, avoided. The magnolias along the drive had grown wild and untrimmed, their roots cracking the stones. The windows of the great house stood half-shuttered, and the fields beyond had gone to weeds. The war had begun. Virginia had seceded. The world was breaking apart, but in Buckingham County, people whispered about something older than politics, older than war, about a house that killed the men who tried to own it. The rumor began with Portwood's death. Then came the merchant from Richmond, who bought the property cheap after Catherine Hafford fled to the city. He was a confident man, broad and loud, who mocked the local talk of curses. Superstition, he said, laughing as he unlocked the front door. If death lives here, I'll sell him cigars. He didn't laugh for long. For the first few months, the plantation seemed peaceful. He hired overseers, reopened the curing barns, and moved his family into the house. His wife redecorated the study, the same study where the colonel and Portwood had both died, ordering the servants to scrub every inch, burn herbs, and air the carpets. The smell never left. It hid in the corners, under the wallpaper. Faint but constant, the scent of old tobacco, heavy and sweet, tinged with something that made people's throats itch. In February of 1862, during a freezing rainstorm, the merchant died in that same study, slumped in the same chair, his lips dark, his hands blackened at the tips, for cigars lay in the tray beside him, burned down to nubs. The doctor who examined him, Nathaniel Grimby, the same man who pronounced the colonel and Portwood dead, felt the chill of recognition. The same symptoms, the same smell, the same room, apoplexy, he said automatically. But his voice trembled this time. He wrote it again on the death certificate. But that night, when he returned to his small office in town, he opened his private journal and made a different note. 3 deaths, same house, same signs. I cannot reconcile coincidence. He described what he'd seen: the gray skin, the dilated pupils, the odor of smoke that clung to the body even after death. He underlined the word smoke twice. Then he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat for a long time staring at the lamplight, trembling in the glass. He had been the county physician for 20 years. He had seen men die of fever, of cholera, of infection, of self-inflicted ruin. But this was different. It was too precise, too consistent. Something in that house, something specific, was killing men, and it wasn't the wrath of God. In the weeks that followed, he visited the plantation again, ostensibly to check on the widow. She had already returned to Richmond. Only hired men remained, paid to keep the property from collapsing entirely. Grimby asked to see the study. They hesitated, then led him in. The air was stale, thick, faintly sweet. The hearth was cold. The furniture covered in white sheets that did little to hide the outlines beneath the desk. The leather chair, the humidor still sitting open. The smoke drifted through a shaft of light. Grimby walked slowly around the room, his handkerchief pressed to his mouth. He saw the cigar box, still half full. He lifted one cigar and turned it between his fingers. The construction was flawless, smooth, tight, uniform. He broke it open. The tobacco inside was dark, perfectly cured. He smelled it carefully. It was rich, strong, but there was something else beneath it, something bitter, He wrote later that he felt a faint tingling in his fingertips after handling the leaf. He washed his hands twice before leaving. Over the next year, the plantation changed hands twice. Each buyer cheaper than the last, each one dying sooner than the one before. One collapsed in his carriage on the road to Farmville. Another died in Richmond in his own bed, but the smell of tobacco lingered on his clothes. Grimby saw the body. The skin told the same story, the slow poisoning of the nervous system, the heart thrashing itself to death. He wrote more entries in his journal, each one darker, more urgent. Symptoms consistent with nicotine toxicity. Lethal concentrations unlikely through ordinary use. Must consider contamination. Cigars possible vector. Origin unknown. He began collecting samples, bits of tobacco, ash from the hearth, even a piece of cloth from the chair's armrest. He sent one sample to a chemist in Lynchburg, asking for analysis. The reply came weeks later, short and unsatisfying. Tobacco unusually potent. Nicotine content far above average. No further conclusion possible. Grimby's nights grew restless. He dreamed of smoke curling from unseen mouths, of eyes watching him through the fog. His wife found him one morning asleep at his desk, ink smeared across his hand. The words "not accident" written over and over on a single-page dot. By 1863, the war had swallowed Virginia. Soldiers marched through Buckingham County, taking what they needed. The fields of the Hafford plantation lay untended, the barns half collapsed, the main house dark except for the occasional glimmer of a trespasser's lantern. The enslaved people had been sold off or scattered. Only the ghosts remained. Grimby returned one last time that spring. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and earth. He found the study door still locked. When he pried it open, the hinges groaned like something waking from sleep. Dust covered everything. The cigar box was still there, though the cigars had dried and cracked. He didn't touch them this time. He simply stood in the center of the room, feeling the weight of the place pressing down on him. He wrote in his journal that night, "This house is cursed, yes, but not by spirits, by human hands. Someone prepared these cigars with intent. The poison acts slowly, accumulates. Whoever began it understood both chemistry and patience. The first death may have been deliberate, the rest consequence." He underlined deliberate twice. Then he closed the book and locked it away when he died in 1867 quietly. In his sleep, his journal was placed in a drawer by his widow and forgotten for nearly 70 years. But the story did not sleep with him. The curse of the Hafford plantation continued to grow, feeding on rumor and fear. The state tried to reclaim the property for unpaid taxes. No one wanted to buy it. Hunters avoided the woods around it. Travelers said their horses shied away from the gates. Local children dared each other to touch the front door and run. They said you could still smell the cigars burning, even though no fire had been lit there in years. In 1868, a new name appeared on the deed, Harold Graham, a Union veteran from Pennsylvania who had made a fortune supplying tobacco to the Army. During the war, he had heard the stories and dismissed them. "The South lives on whispers," he told his wife as they stood at the gate, looking up at the sagging house. "Well, bring it back to life." He hired laborers to rebuild the barns, repaint the walls, replace the broken windows. The neighbors watched from a distance, shaking their heads. When the smoke began rising from the chimneys again, they said the curse had been disturbed inside. Graham set up a study of his own. He found the colonel's old furniture still intact, the desk, the leather chair, even the humidor, and inside it, to his delight, he discovered several boxes of cigars, sealed and untouched. "Fine Virginia stock," he said proudly, "worth a fortune." He lit one that night as he wrote in his new ledger, the scent of tobacco curling through the room like a living thing. His wife complained that it made her dizzy. He laughed and told her she just wasn't used to strong Southern tobacco. For months, everything seemed fine. Graham prospered. The fields grew again. The house echoed with life. But in late summer, he began to cough, then to shake, then to sweat at night. He lost weight. His hands trembled. He told the doctor it was the heat. The doctor said it was nerves. His wife begged him to stop smoking. He refused. "It's the one pleasure I brought home from the war," he said. "I'll not give it up now." In September, he collapsed at his desk. His wife found him at dawn, slumped over his papers, the cigar still burning between his fingers. The doctor who examined him, a young man from Richmond named Edmund Vorders, read Grimby's old reports and felt the same chill run through him. He sent the cigars to a chemist in the city. The analysis was unmistakable. The nicotine concentration was several times normal, enough to kill a man slowly over months. Waters rode back to Buckingham County that very night. He ordered the remaining cigars destroyed, but when he arrived, it was already delayed. Graham was cold, his lips blue, the smell of smoke still thick in the air. Waters stayed in the house long enough to write a full report. Then he left and never returned. The locals said he'd seen the ghost of the tobacco man in the study that night, a shadow in the corner, silent and still. But in truth, what he'd seen was worse, the evidence of deliberate genius, of revenge refined to science. He wrote later, "These deaths are not random. They are linked by a single hand, guided by intellect and intention. If the stories of an enslaved tobacconist named Benjamin are true, then this may be the most remarkable act of retribution in Virginia's history." But he kept that thought to himself. The war was over. The nation wanted peace, not tales of vengeance. The files went into storage. The Hafford plantation fell silent again. For decades, the land lay empty. Grass grew over the drive. Trees split the foundations. The house sagged into its own shadow. Travelers claimed they saw lights moving through the windows, smoke curling from the chimneys though no fire burned. They said it was the colonel, still trying to finish his cigar. They said it was the overseer, gasping for breath. They said it was Benj himself, returned to watch the white men choke on their own wealth. But the truth was simpler, colder, and far more human. The curse was real, yes, but it had been made by hands, not by heaven. The tobacco that had built fortunes had also built a weapon. Each leaf, each roll, each slow curl of smoke carried the mark of a man who had once been property, who had once been silent, who had once decided that patience could kill, and long after he was gone, his work endured. The plantation would never truly die. It would simply wait like the cigars hidden in its walls, for someone foolish enough to light them again. Winter of 1870 settled over Richmond like a gray shroud. The war was gone, but its echo remained in the cracked walls and the hollow eyes of men who'd survived it. The city smelled of smoke, coal dust, and cheap whiskey. Inside a narrow office on Grace Street, Dr. Edmund Waters sat at his desk, the last of the daylight fading behind the frosted glass. His hands ached from writing. His breath made small ghosts in the cold. He was tired of death, of seeing it, naming it, explaining it away. He thought he was finished with Buckingham County. He thought the Hafford plantation was buried with the men who tried to own it. But that was before the letter arrived. It came without warning, sealed in plain brown paper, bearing a Boston postmark and no return address. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, educated. He slid it open with his scalpel. A faint smell of tobacco rose from the pages. "Sir," it began, "I understand you have been investigating the deaths at the former Hafford plantation in Buckingham County. I write to inform you that your suspicions are correct." Waters' hand froze. He read on. "My name is Benjamin Freeman, formerly the property of Colonel Marcus Hafford. I killed him." The words hit like a strike of thunder. The letter continued, calm, methodical, written with the precision of a surgeon's notes. Freeman described his education in secret, his study of poisons, his discovery of nicotine's power. He described how he had begun testing it, how he had built the poison slowly, disguised in flavor and smoke. "I did not act in rage," the letter said. "I acted in order. I acted in reason. I gave him the same slow death he gave to others, not with a whip, but with patience." Waters read on, his breath shallow. The writer spoke of the months of preparation, the careful balance of dosage, the way the colonel's body had weakened long before that final night. He thought he smoked triumph, the letter said. In truth, he smoked his own undoing. "I left others behind gifts for those who would profit from his death. They'd smoked, they'd learned." Waters felt a chill crawl along his spine. This wasn't confession, it was declaration. The voice on the page was proud, articulate, almost serene. The man who had written it wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was asserting mastery. "I live now under my own name," the letter said. "Freeman, by my own choosing. I have a wife, children, and a trade in tobacco. I work with the same leaf that once enslaved me, but now it feeds my family. I have no remorse. I am proof that knowledge is power, and that patience can be sharper than the blade." The last lines were written with a darker ink, as if pressed harder into the paper. "I am not haunted by what I did. Those who burned, whipped, and sold men for profit called it order. I call what I did justice. The house at Buckingham is not cursed by spirits. It is cursed by memory, by the taste of what it created. Tell the world if you wish." "I have already told the truth." The signature was neat and deliberate. Benjamin Freeman. Waters sat for a long time staring at the page. The fire had burned low. The sounds of horses in the street drifted faintly through the window. He knew what this letter meant. It was the missing piece proof that all those deaths, all those whispers of curses and bad air, had come from the hand of one man who refused to remain a shadow. He read the letter again, slower this time, hearing the rhythm beneath the words, the calm of intellect, the symmetry of revenge. He imagined Freeman at his desk in Boston, the lamplight on his face, perhaps a cigar smoldering in an ashtray beside him. He imagined the same calm, the same precision, not a monster, but a man who had learned the rules of his enemy and used them better. For a moment, Waters felt the strange pull of admiration, then guilt, then something else and understanding too deep for judgment. He thought of the colonel, the overseer, the merchants, all dead by their own vice. He thought of the system that had allowed them to own other human beings and call it God's will. He poured a drink, hands shaking slightly, and read the letter one last time. Then he struck a match and touched it to the corner of the page. The fire spread fast. The handwriting curled and blackened. The words that had confessed to for murders turned to ash. He dropped what remained into the fireplace and watched it burn. The smell of tobacco filled the room, faint but unmistakable. That night, he wrote his own final entry in the Hafford file. It was brief and clinical. Further evidence indicates deliberate adulteration of tobacco with nicotine extract. Responsible party unknown. All remaining materials destroyed. Cause of deaths, accidental ingestion of toxic substances. Case closed. He sealed the file and placed it in his cabinet. Then he sat back and listened to the wind outside scraping against the shutters. For a long time, he didn't move. He was thinking about what freedom costs and who gets to decide the price. Years passed. The Hafford plantation decayed into ruin. By the time the century turned, it was little more than a skeleton of stone and wood. Vines crawled up the columns. The roof sagged inward. Local farmers avoided the place. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to go near the study. They said the air made them dizzy. They said you could still smell tobacco smoke, even in the rain. Children from neighboring farms dared each other to run up the porch steps at night. They told stories of a ghost with dark skin and calm eyes, sitting in the colonel's chair, rolling cigars from leaves that glowed in the dark. Parents said it was foolish talk, but when the wind blew from the east, carrying that faint, unmistakable scent of sweet, burning leaf, even the adults closed their windows. In 1894, in a small house on Beacon Street in Boston, Benjamin Freeman died at the age of 68. His obituary in the local paper was short and respectful. A respected tobacconist, a deacon of the church, survived by his wife Harriet and 3 children, known for his craftsmanship and kindness of spirit. No one in Boston knew about Virginia. No one spoke of the poison, or the deaths, or the fire that had once burned inside him. He was buried under a simple headstone that read, Benjamin Freeman, 1826 to 1894. Beloved husband and father, at rest. But rest was never the point. His story had already taken root past quietly among the freedmen, who had once labored in the fields of Virginia. They told it in churches and taverns, in whispers around fires, in the hush between songs. The details blurred, but the message remained. One of their own had struck back, not with fire or fury, but with knowledge. Some said he'd been caught and hanged. Others said he'd escaped to England. Some said his spirit guarded the plantation still. The truth was quieter, simpler, but more powerful than all the legends. He had lived free, educated his children, and died surrounded by family. He had become what he was never meant to be, a man beyond fear. In the 1930s, when scholars rediscovered the forgotten journals of Dr. Grimby and Dr. Waters, they pieced together the fragments. The pattern was unmistakable. 5 deaths, all linked to the same tobacco, the same plantation, the same invisible hand. They published papers about the case, calling it the Hafford mystery. Academics debated whether Freeman's letter had ever truly existed. Some said it was apocryphal, a myth invented to explain coincidence. Others saw it as the earliest documented act of chemical resistance in American history. But the locals never doubted. To them, the plantation was proof that the earth remembers. They said the land had soaked up the blood, the sweat, and the fury of generations. They said it had finally answered back. By the time the main house burned in 1889, no one tried to rebuild it. Farmers planted corn where tobacco once grew. The barns collapsed into the weeds. The roads shifted. but on certain autumn evenings when the wind was still, smoke could be seen rising in a thin gray ribbon from the place where the study once stood. The smell was faint, but unmistakable, warm, bitter, sweet. Old men in Buckingham County still tell that story on porches at dusk, their voices low and steady. They say a man once turned his master's wealth into his master's grave. They say he used patience like a blade. They say the tobacco fields of Virginia still whisper his name when the wind blows through them. And maybe they're right. Maybe the past never really dies. Maybe it just waits buried in paper, in soil, in the bloodlines of families who've forgotten what their land cost. When historians write of rebellion, they write of armies and speeches, of battles and proclamations. They don't write about the quiet man with ink on his fingers and a plan in his head. They don't write about the patience it takes to outlive your oppressors, to make the earth itself your witness. But that's where the truth is, in the patience. In the slow burn dot, if you walk those fields today, there's nothing left of the house. The stones lie scattered, half swallowed by ivy. The magnolias have grown thick, their roots twisting through what was once the parlor. In summer, the air smells of earth and leaves. But sometimes, when the heat rises just right, you can catch another scent beneath it, sharp, sweet, unmistakable. Tobacco, old, heavy, the kind that clings to history like a shadow that won't leave. The locals don't go near it after dark. They say the air there hums, that if you stand still long enough you can hear the faint creak of a chair, the scratch of a match, the whisper of breath drawn through a cigar that no one lit. Some say it's the colonel. Some say it's the doctor. Most say it's him, the tobacco man, who made the master smoke their own death. No one can prove it. No one tries. The story endures because it's true in ways truth can't measure. Because it isn't about ghosts, it's about memory. About the way injustice never really dies. It just changes shape. About how sometimes the only power left to the powerless is patience. The soil of Buckingham County still grows good crops. Corn, soy, sometimes even tobacco again. But no matter what they plant, the farmers say the ground has a taste to it, rich, dark, and faintly bitter. The past, they say, never leaves the land. It only hides beneath the roots, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find it. And if you ever light a cigar on a warm Virginia night and taste something strange, something that burns a little too deep, something that lingers on the tongue longer than it should, you might remember the story. You might think of the man who rolled death into leaf and smoke, who turned patience into justice, who walked north into freedom and never looked back, because the past is never really dead. It's not even past.